Hello everyone and welcome to this month's episode of Briks with Bask. This time we are revisiting the topic of hopping, episode 193, where we discuss this unique form of locomotion that is used and has evolved in multiple different groups of animals. For this, I decided to build a kangaroo rat. Kangaroo would have potentially been a more characteristic, charismatic, famous hopping member. But the reason I went with Kangaroo Rat is, one, I think they're super cute, and that has to count for something. Two, one of the most fascinating things I learned while David led that episode was how many different times hopping, bipedal hopping, so hopping with the back feet only, evolved in rodents. I thought it was just the kangaroo rat and that there were many species and they lived in different places. I didn't realize that there were multiple kinds of hopping rodents, or at least not as many as there are. So I feel that's worth giving some attention to with this build. And this is probably the biggest reason I decided to go this way with the build. Getting to build a kangaroo rat out of Legos means for probably one of the only times in this series, I can build a life-size version of the animal I'm building, or roughly life-size. So that's going to be the aim for this build, is a life-size kangaroo rat. So let's jump right in. The hopping episode, we discussed the different ways that animals have used hopping, or use hopping, to get around. Now, there's different kinds of quote-unquote hopping, or things that get called hopping, but there are kind of different specific versions of it. We discussed that in the episode, so I'm only going to go over it briefly here, just so we can then focus on why kangaroo rats are so unique and exciting. There is frog hopping, which is really just a series of jumping, where many frogs can't really walk. They jump from place to place, jump after jump after jump. So jump, land. And then you have like rabbit hopping, which is really called bounding, where they keep their front feet moving together and their back feet moving together. And it's very much like little jumps, but they land on the front feet first. And then as the back feet come down, they're starting the next bound. So it's kind of a mix between a gallop and hopping, or jumping. Then you get weird stuff like pronking, which some antelopes do, where they jump with all four legs straight up into the air, and it's kind of a way to show off, either to competition or to demonstrate to predators how fit they are. And while being chased, they will pronk, and this is thought to be a way to show the predator, I'm not worth chasing, look how athletic I am. Bipedal hopping, which is the kind of the most extreme hopping, and often what people think of, is something that has evolved in different groups. Today, just mammals, and is known famously from kangaroos. So hopping repeatedly on the back feet, but also kangaroo rats and hopping mice and jerboas and spring hares. All 5 of these groups hop on the back legs basically in the same way and with very similar anatomy and living in very similar places, which is oddly consistent for such a unique feature. Like, not much life on our planet hops around, and the fact that it seems similar animals living similar lives in similar places are the ones to have all evolved it suggests that bipedal hopping is particularly useful in these habitats or for these kinds of lifestyles. All of these animals are herbivores. They all live in arid, dry environments, different parts of the world. Kangaroo rats are found in North America. Jerboas are from North Africa and Asia. Spring hares, or the South African spring hares, are also from Africa. And then hopping mice, along with kangaroos, are from Australia. But they all live in dry, arid, desertified areas very often, and are plant eaters. So very similar habitats, and they have very similar anatomy, which makes sense since they are moving around in the same way, basically. All of them have long back legs and very long tails, which is often used as a counterbalance for this hopping locomotion. So they all end up looking kind of similar. You know, they just look like kangaroos and then a bunch of rodents that are kangaroo shaped, or you know, a bunch of hopping rodents and then kangaroos which are hopping rodent shaped, whichever way you want to look at it. This is fascinating to me. Something about living in these arid environments and being herbivores seems to make this hopping lifestyle useful and particularly beneficial. Now, this could be that arid environments are typically very open. You know, they're not closed forests. They typically aren't like mountainous and valleyed, you know, though you can have dry habitats, but these deserts are typically very open, wide areas. Hopping like this is a very efficient way to get around. Kangaroos are famous for being energy efficient for how fast they can move while hopping. You know, they can keep speeds that match very fast running animals, and they are using less energy while doing it because hopping is a great way to recapture some of the energy. They push off to start a hop, move up in the air and move forward, and then as they come down, they recollect some of that energy by compressing both legs to hop again. So it's very much like a pogo stick, where it takes some energy to get a pogo stick going for the first few bounces, but then with just a little bit of added energy from your body, you can keep the pogo stick going with very little energy. You know, it doesn't tire your legs out because you're not having to push down every time to get the next spring. The spring captures that energy and releases it again. So you end up getting to recycle a lot of that bouncing energy. Kangaroos do a very similar thing with their tendons and leg joints, and I believe that is true for many of the other hoppers, though I haven't seen that specifically mentioned. But hopping can be a very efficient way of getting around, so it might be useful in these wide open habitats. It also is really useful for prey animals because hopping is a really confusing way to run away. When you're bouncing, you can change direction pretty quickly because each time you land and get ready to bounce off again, to hop again, you can kind of change your direction. And so hopping animals can be much more erratic in their movements than, say, a running animal could. And I think this is demonstrated really well by, if you ever seen the videos of kangaroo mice dodging rattlesnakes and dodging predators, they can just launch off in a random direction with a push off of those back legs and then be hopping. You know, so they don't have to start running away from the direction they're facing. You know, hopping can let you just bounce in a direction, and if your predator can't predict which way you're going to be going, it gives you a much higher chance of duping them, getting that first leap away before they can react or grab you, and then you're off and hopping. So it's a really good defensive mechanism. So yeah, I was fascinated by how consistent bipedal hoppers evolved. It also blew my mind that the different hopping rodents, kangaroo rats, hopping mice, jerboas, and spring hares, are each different groups of hopping rodents. They did not come from a hopping shared ancestor. Each of these desert-dwelling rodents evolved it separately. So like already having kangaroos and kangaroo rats is a pretty impressive level of convergent evolution. But having it happen 4 times in rodents alone is crazy. It kind of makes you wonder why we don't have bipedal hopping other mammals. If it's so easy to evolve, why isn't everyone not doing it? And maybe it's not so easy. Maybe rodents are particularly good at it. But I love it. It's awesome, it's fascinating, and it's so cool. They also end up looking very similar. Spring hares look more, they kind of look like a rabbit, which is where the hair comes from in their name. So they don't look quite as similar, but kangaroo rats and hopping mice are very similar looking, and jerboas have a little bit longer ears, you know, slightly taller in their overall posture. But those 3 groups look incredibly similar. Part of that's just being rodents, and rodents look like rodents very often, but it really speaks to how distinctive the features are for being a hopping animal like this. Evidently, it is a really consistent set of attributes and evolutionary pressures that lead you to being a bipedally hopping animal, or at least rodent. So at this point in the build, it's pretty far along with the overall profile, so needing to fill in and add the legs. I was wanting to go for a pose that I found in one of the reference pictures I used while building this. That was just very typical posture that these rodents have, that kangaroo rats will take while they're foraging in the sand for seeds, which is their main food, where they're just kind of hunched over and there's just this little rotund ball of kangaroo rat. And I thought that was a very characteristic pose for them, and just captures them very well. So I wanted to go with that profile. I did want it to be somewhat posable, as I've said in my many other builds. So I'm making the legs hinged, jointed, so that way the kangaroo rat can also pop its face up and, give a sniff around, sniff the air or look up. And I can't quite get it in a full-on hopping, fast-paced hopping pose. Maybe with some modifications that could be achieved, or with a stand. But for this one, just a little calm kangaroo rat was what I was going with. And getting the rounded profile was an interesting challenge. Getting rounded shapes in Legos is always kind of interesting, because by their nature, they are blocks. Very right-angled geometric shapes very often. And so trying to get smooth curves in it can sometimes take a lot of tweaking and finagling. And I was very happy with the profile I was able to achieve with this one. The face is maybe a little bit long, but overall looks pretty kangaroo ratty to me. I also wanted to be sure to give it their long tail, which is, as I've mentioned, a characteristic feature of these hopping rodents. Kangaroo rats have very long tails, longer than their whole body, and many of the other groups also have very long tails. I don't think spring hares have quite as long of tails compared to their body, but jerboas have long tails, hopping mice have very long tails. Kangaroos also have very long tails, though their tail is weird compared to the others. The others have these long balancing tails, while kangaroos have a very muscular tail that they use as a counterbalance while they're hopping. It bounces and helps to maintain their balance and the hopping momentum, but they also use it as a fifth leg to help them walk, which is something that is characteristic of many of the hopping groups, that while they're moving and while they're hopping in high speed, they're using their typical hopping posture and locomotion. But when they're moving at slow speed, many of these hopping animals we mentioned earlier have different ways of getting around. For rabbits, it's basically still little bounds. They're still keeping their two front paws and their two back paws in sync with each other. Kangaroos cannot walk. Not really good at moving their limbs separately. So they move in a similar way, but because their back legs are so specialized, they have to use their tail as a balance so that they form a tripod with their two front paws and their tail while they move the legs forward. With kangaroo rats, surprisingly, when they move at slow speeds, they kind of just move like a mouse. Like, they've got big back legs, so they're a little bit, not cumbersome, but very obvious in their movements because their legs are so large. But watching videos of them just, scurrying around while they're looking for food, they kind of just move like a mouse. So they can just move very much like a typical rodent, but then they can shift into their hopping, which is good for moving around a bit more efficiently, a bit more quickly, and they can, move at speed or just little hops. So yeah, they seem to be pretty versatile. I don't know about the other hopping rodents. I did not do deep dives into each of them to see how they move at slower speeds. But kangaroo rats are not seemingly as limited as some other hopping animals, both in, that they can walk more normally when they move slowly, but also, like, kangaroos are very good hopping for fast pace movement, and they can jump very high, but they're not typically doing a lot of just like acrobatic leaps. they're big animals, so that's part of it. But kangaroo rats, when they leap, they can do flips and turns. They use their tail like a cat does to reorient themselves in the air. There's a great YouTube video of them dodging rattlesnakes, like I mentioned before, that has a lot of slow-mo of them dodging the snake strike, but then flipping themselves right side up mid-air to land again. So not only are they good at like fast-paced hopping to get away from stuff and to travel, but they're also good at really acrobatic, athletic, gymnastic leaps and jumps and twists and turns. So it's also neat to see that though a lot of these hopping animals are shaped very similarly with a lot of similar adaptations for this lifestyle and this way of moving, there is still quite a bit of difference, at least between some of them, and that it's not always a limiting factor in how the animal lives or moves. So yeah, kangaroo rats just are very interesting to me because other than their very long legs and tail, they are very much just a rodent, very mouse-like. They're in separate group from true mice, but just they have cheek pouches that they carry their seeds in when they take them back to their burrows. They burrow like many other rodents. So all in all, very much just a typical rodent with the extra feature of really long legs, really long tail that makes them extremely good hoppers. So just very fun in that regard. Their back legs are extremely long, as long as the rest of their body, and not including the tail. And a big portion of it is what on us would be the foot. So just like kangaroos, that long bottom portion is the foot and heel, and then the rest of the leg is above that. So their foot and heel on kangaroo rats is about as long as any of the other leg bones they have. So these incredibly exaggerated long legs that give them this hopping and leaping ability, which in addition to making them very good jumpers and all that good stuff, these long legs are also, I think, a huge reason why they are so adorable. They've got just these unreasonably long legs and feet for such tiny bodies. I think they are extremely cute. Their long tail is also part of that it's too much tail for such a little animal. It's almost twice as long as they are, and that's crazy. It also has a little tuft on the end, which I will be adding to the tail of this build when I get there. And I don't know, I noticed that the other hopping rodents, many of them also had tail tufts. And I don't know if that's something about balancing, if having that tail tuft makes it balance weight better. Is it for when they're flipping around in the air that having a poof of fur on the end gives them more air resistance for the tail when it's spinning and reorienting their position? Is it display? Is it why the tail tuft? Like I said, a bunch of them have it, and I don't know what advantage to being hopping rodents a tail tuft provides. So that's something that I find very interesting about them. An odd consistency among their many other shared features. That mystery aside, though, it is adorable. So another pro in that category for kangaroo rats and hopping rodents in general. With this build, I colored it before I had actually finished building everything, because the colors I was aiming for are not as common as colors that I used in a lot of the other sets. This one, I wanted the colors to be something specific. If I'm building a prehistoric animal, I can make the colors whatever I want. And if I'm building, something made up like Compsognathus or Godzilla, then the colors aren't actually important because it doesn't exist. This one, we know what color kangaroo rats are, and it varies. There are different colorations. They're not all the exact same color. But I did want to try to get them as close as possible, so I wanted to make sure I'm using pieces that come in the colors that I'm needing. So in this case, I did end up coloring things up front so that I could make sure I didn't accidentally finish the build with a critical piece that only comes in blue or some other incredibly clashing color that would not fit this build. So, as I've said in the other videos, coloring Lego builds always a very interesting challenge because it often requires making creative compromises. Like, for instance, with the ears on this build, that is by far the only piece that I will be satisfied as the ear. It's the right size, it's the right shape, it can be posed so you can make him pop out his little ears if you want. So just perfect. It only comes in this nougat color. That's the only color it comes in that is close to any of these dark tans I'm using. So just kind of have to decide that that's going to be okay because there's not really another option. If it comes out in tan later on down the line, then I'll replace it. But for now, it'll just be slightly different colored ears. And so it's always a very interesting challenge when building with Legos of, you know, this is the right piece, but it's not the right color, and trying to find that balance between getting the right shape you want, but having your set be a cohesive color and consistent look at the end. It's always a balancing act of, I want it to be the right shape, but I also want it to be the right color and blend in with everything else. And it's one of the things that I have the most fun with building in Legos is that creative compromise and finding that middle ground between the shape you want it to be and the pieces that actually will work and the colors they actually come in. So it's just a very satisfying process. So starting to wrap up with this build, and I think I've said about all the knowledge I have to say about Kangaroo Rats. One thing we did go over in the episode that I'm not going to go over in its entirety here since we did that there, but we do have fossil evidence of hoppers similar to Kangaroo Rats and the other ones we've mentioned. Mainly that the direct evidence for that comes from footprint pathways that show hopping footprints. You know, there are frog pathways that show the jumping, frog landing, so it just looks like a frog stamp over and over. And there are pathways of hopping mammals, some that show bounding like rabbits, and then at least a few that show evidence of bipedal hopping, where you just see a single pair of footprints right side by side to each other over and over and over, and its back feet just landing over and over. And so we know that there have been other hopping groups, probably not the same ones as around today, maybe other rodents, but I think some date back to before rodents were around, so they would have been some other group of mammals, some more ancient group. And so hopping has been a good thing, has been a useful way to survive for quite some time. And it makes me wonder, were they also herbivorous desert dwellers? You know, how many similarities did they also have? Did they also have really long tails? How consistent are the features of bipedal hoppers? It's such a unique lifestyle that we only have a few examples of today, but the fact that it's so consistent among all of them suggests that it probably would be with a lot of the fossil examples as well, which I find incredibly satisfying. That is such a cool concept and neat idea. And with that, we can wrap up this build. That's my Kangaroo Rat. I like them. They're tiny, they're cute. I'm very pleased. Should be a roughly life-size Kangaroo Rat. Hope you all enjoyed. As always, if you would like to build your own Kangaroo Rat, you can find links down in the description to the instructions and parts list for this build. If you are inspired to build your own hopping Lego set, please do, and share pictures on our Discord. I'd love to see any of your builds for hopping or of this Kangaroo Rat. You can find links in the description for our Discord channel. If you would like to support this series, you can also find links down there for our Patreon. And I'll see you next month for the next episode of Briks with Bask. Next month is June, which means we are going to be in Croc Month. So expect a properly themed episode. Bye till then.